The wedding was perfect, at least on the surface. A sunlit garden, rows of white chairs, soft classical music floating through the breeze. Guests in designer suits and pastel dresses murmured politely, sipping champagne under garlands of roses. And yet, in the very last row, nearly hidden behind a floral column, sat a man who didn't belong. Matthew Thompson adjusted the rainbow pin on his lapel. It was small, discreet, but it shone like a silent protest in a crowd of polished tradition. He had not been invited. In fact, no one had spoken his name since the engagement was announced. But here he was, seated at the edge of a celebration meant to exclude him, his back straight, his gaze sharp, and in his coat pocket, a crumpled message that read, "Don't let the child become the next victim." The groom, James Thompson, was his older brother. Sarah, the bride, was a kind-faced woman with a quiet laugh, and a single mother to a little girl named Emma. Matthew had never met her, not officially, but he'd seen enough to know what could happen behind closed doors when the music faded and the curtains fell. James hadn't noticed him yet. Matthew had arrived early, slipping into a seat before the ushers could block his way. No one recognized him, or if they did, they said nothing. Most had assumed he'd cut ties with the family years ago, and that was partially true. He'd been 17 the night he left home. 17. Bruised not on his skin, but in places no one saw. A boy with a suitcase, a scholarship, and no one waving goodbye. Now he was 35, a quiet man with a steady brow, a studio apartment, and memories that never quite softened. He didn't come back for weddings, or birthdays, or Christmas. But today was different. He watched as the guests began to take their seats. Laughter, champagne flutes, camera flashes. In the front row sat Evelyn Thompson, their mother proud and stiff in her lavender dress, nodding approvingly at everyone except the back row. Matthew didn't expect her to look at him. She hadn't answered his letters, not since the last one, the one he sent after James had found him kissing a boy behind the school gym. That day, James hadn't yelled. He hadn't hit. He had simply stared, gone home, and told their parents. The silence that followed had cut deeper than any bruise. Evelyn called it a phase. His father called it shame. They never spoke of it again, until Matthew disappeared. And now, almost 2 decades later, James was about to become a husband, a stepfather, a man everyone admired. Everyone. Except the one person who remembered what the walls of their childhood really sounded like. Matthew didn't come to ruin the wedding. He came because someone had to see what others refused to see. He came because Emma was 6 years old, with wide eyes and a nervous giggle, and she reminded him of himself. Back then, he didn't have someone to speak up. Today, he would. As the string quartet shifted into the wedding march, Matthew folded the paper in his hand and tucked it into his coat. The words haunted him. Don't let the child become the next victim. He didn't know who had sent it, but deep down, he had always known it would come to this, and he would not walk away this time. If this story speaks to you, if you've ever felt like the one left out in a moment that should have been shared, join us on Heart Story, where every voice matters and every truth deserves to be told. In the bridal suite, Sarah stood in front of a full-length mirror, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. The makeup artist dabbed at the corner of her lips. She smiled, but her hands wouldn't stay still. In just moments, she would walk down the aisle toward what everyone insisted was her second chance at love. Her daughter, Emma, sat cross-legged near the window, humming softly to herself as she traced shapes into the fog glass. The little girl wore a white dress trimmed with blue ribbons. Her curls bounced with each movement. She looked happy, safe. Sarah believed that today marked the beginning of a stable future for herself, and especially for Emma. After years of being alone, she had finally found someone who called her strong, who helped her fix the kitchen sink, who remembered Emma's birthday, who said all the right things at the right time. She didn't know that her future was already watching quietly from the back row. Meanwhile, outside in the reception garden, James walked through the rows of chairs, shaking hands, laughing at jokes he barely heard. He looked composed, handsome in a tailored black suit, but there was a flicker in his eyes when a waiter passed too closely. His jaw tightened when a guest asked about Emma, casually referring to her as your daughter now. James nodded, too quickly, too tightly. Behind the scenes, tension brewed in hushed comments and subtle glances. Chloe, one of the bridesmaids and Sarah's oldest friend, had noticed. She had noticed the way James barely glanced at Emma when she tugged at his coat. She had noticed the way he ignored the drawing she proudly held up at the rehearsal dinner. But Chloe said nothing. It was Sarah's day, and doubt had no place at a wedding. Still, when Chloe stepped aside for some air and caught sight of a man sitting alone at the very back of the aisle, she paused. Something about him was familiar. The rainbow pin. The way he sat, motionless, yet completely alert. She walked over, her heels soft on the grass. "Excuse me," she said gently. "You're not on the guest list, are you?" The man turned. His face was calm, his posture unthreatening. "No," he replied. "I'm not." Chloe narrowed her eyes, then recognition struck. "You're James's brother," she whispered. Matthew didn't flinch. "I was..." A beat of silence passed between them. "Why are you here?" she asked. Matthew looked toward the front where Sarah and Emma would soon appear. His eyes softened. "Because someone in that house needs protection," he said. "Even if they don't know it yet." Chloe hesitated, then returned to her seat, unsettled. Back inside the bridal suite, Sarah was laughing. Evelyn had entered with a small bouquet of gardenias. The mother of the groom looked polished, pleased, and slightly tired of waiting. She adjusted the hem of Sarah's dress and murmured, "Let's hope today goes smoothly." No embarrassing surprises like what Matthew once pulled at his cousin's wedding. The room went still. Sarah blinked. "I didn't know James had a brother." Evelyn froze for a breath, then forced a smile. "It's better that way." Outside, the guests were rising. The ceremony was about to begin. Matthew sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He hadn't expected to be noticed, but now Chloe knew. That was enough. He wasn't here to make speeches. He was here to see, to be ready, because deep inside he felt it. Something was going to happen, something no one would be able to ignore. The ceremony had reached that delicate silence between the last violin note and the first step of the bride. White petals lined the aisle. The officiant cleared his throat, and at the front, James stood waiting, chin high, expression practiced, hands slightly twitching in his pocket. Sarah appeared, radiant and calm, holding Emma's hand as they walked side by side. The crowd turned to admire them. Soft gasps, smiles, phones quietly lifted. Emma skipped it for a moment, delighted by the floating petals, then stopped to straighten the small flower basket in her hands. Her fingers brushed Sarah's arm. James offered a tight smile. He didn't reach for her. The bride and her daughter took their place under the arch of roses. Emma stood between them, fidgeting a little. The sun hit the edge of her curls. As the officiant welcomed everyone, Emma leaned forward, whispering something to Sarah. Then, in an innocent burst of excitement, she turned, reaching for a vase at the side of the platform. It happened in an instant. The glass slipped, a bouquet tumbled, water spilled, the vase shattered at James's feet. The silence was instant and cold. James's eyes flared, without thinking, without looking around. He reached down and struck Emma's open palm across the cheek. A sharp crack, a single wound, and then a voice cut through the air like a blade. "That's enough." All heads turned. At the very back of the aisle, Matthew stood, his voice didn't tremble. His body didn't move except to lift his hand, slow and deliberate. As he stepped into the center of the aisle, James froze. Sarah's hand flew to Emma's face. Matthew moved forward. Each step was measured, unhurried, impossible to ignore. No one stopped him. No one spoke. When he reached the front, he knelt beside Emma and gently took her hand. She flinched. He waited. Then, without force, he helped her up and stood between her and James. "This," Matthew said, his voice steady, "is exactly what I lived through for years." Behind closed doors, behind smiling family portraits and polite church pews, I was that child, and I won't let it happen again. James stepped forward, fury boiling under his skin. "You don't get to tell me how to raise a child," he hissed. Matthew didn't blink. "No," he said, "but I've never hit one in the middle of my wedding vows." A murmur spread through the crowd. Sarah, pale and shaking, took Emma into her arms. The girl buried her face into her mother's shoulder. No one knew what to say. No one moved. James turned toward the guests, desperate to regain control, but the damage had spread too wide. His mother's face was frozen in horror. Chloe stood beside the arch, eyes locked on Matthew. The officiant slowly lowered his book. Matthew turned to Sarah. "I didn't come to destroy this day, but I saw it coming. Someone even warned me it would. That child deserves better." James laughed once, dry and cruel. "You're just bitter. You were always the broken one." Matthew nodded. "Yes, and I rebuilt myself, without ever raising my hand against someone smaller than me." He stepped back then, not as a man defeated, but as someone who had said what needed to be said. Sarah looked at James, then at Emma's cheek, and finally at Matthew. Something shifted in her eyes. She whispered something to her daughter, turned back toward the crowd, and walked away from the altar, holding Emma close, each step louder than applause. The wedding was broken, but something else had just begun. The ceremony site stood frozen, stunned in the wake of Sarah's quiet exit. No dramatic shouting, no shattered glass, just the haunting stillness of a celebration that had collapsed under the weight of a single slap. The guests whispered in disbelief. Some lowered their phones. Others stared at James, who stood alone under the arch, fists clenched, jaw tight, face exposed in a way not even a tailored suit could protect. Matthew didn't stay in the spotlight. He had said what needed to be said, but as he turned to leave, his steps slow and purposeful. A voice called out behind him, not James, not Evelyn. It was Chloe. She stepped forward from the bridesmaids' line, her dress swaying gently in the breeze. "I should have said something earlier," she said aloud. Not to Matthew, but to the crowd. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. 2 years ago, at the community fundraiser, I saw James push a child yard because the boy accidentally spilled juice on his tie. Gasps rippled through the guests. "I told myself it was a bad day," she continued, "that maybe he was just stressed, but I kept remembering that boy's face, the way he froze, the way James never apologized." James turned toward her, stunned. "You're twisting things," he said sharply. "You don't know what you saw." Chloe looked him straight in the eye. "I know exactly what I saw." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Sarah had disappeared with the Emma into the building, but the damage was already public. A guest near the back had been filming since the moment Matthew stood up. His phone was still raised, the screen glowing. Another guest whispered, then opened their live stream app. It didn't take long for the video to spread. Matthew didn't speak again. He simply nodded to Chloe's silent gratitude in a single look and turned to walk away. But he hadn't made it far when he felt a hand lightly touch his arm. Sarah. She stood there, Emma in her arms, her veil gone, her eyes puffy but clear. "I didn't know," she said softly, "about any of it, about your past, about him." Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry for not asking." Matthew didn't know what to say, so he stayed silent, waiting. "I watched you step in for a child who wasn't even yours," Sarah continued. "I thought I was marrying someone who would protect us, but you were the one who did." Emma peeked out from her mother's shoulder. Her cheek was still red, but her eyes had stopped crying. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. Matthew gave her a small nod, then looked down at Emma. "You're very brave," he said quietly. "Much braver than I was at your age." Before Sarah could respond, someone pushed through the guests. It was Evelyn. Her steps were uncertain, her mouth tight with emotion. But for the first time since childhood, Matthew saw something human in her face. Not pride, not control, not superiority. Regret. She stood a few feet away from him, surrounded by the same guests who once applauded her speeches, her dinners, her polished appearances. "I came to see my son get married," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I didn't know I would also see the son I turned away finally stand tall." Matthew didn't move. He didn't trust this moment. Too many years had passed, too many words left unsaid, but Evelyn didn't ask for forgiveness. "I raised James to be strong," she continued, looking down. "But I see now I taught him strength without kindness. And you, Matthew, you were the one who understood right from wrong, even when no one stood beside you." A silence fell over the crowd. Not shame, not pity, understanding. Matthew looked at her, unsure of what to believe. But there was no performance in Evelyn's posture now. She looked older than he remembered, smaller. He gave the faintest nod, then turned back towards Sarah and Emma. The cameras had stopped. The crowd had thinned. But in that small circle of truth, something real had formed. It wasn't a wedding. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The week that followed was a blur in headlines and hashtags. The wedding that wasn't became a story shared across social platforms, picked up by blogs, debated in parenting forums, discussed in queer advocacy spaces. The video, 37 seconds of silence, a slap, and a brother's stand had crossed 1 million views by the weekend. But Matthew kept the world at a distance. He spent most of those days alone, walking the quiet paths near his apartment, checking in remotely with the early education nonprofit where he worked. His phone buzzed constantly, interview requests, messages from strangers, notes of support from others who had survived childhood like his. He read some, ignored most. The attention felt strange, even unwanted, because at the heart of it all wasn't a viral video. It was a child, Emma, and she was the reason he answered Sarah's call on Sunday morning. The hospital room was quiet. Emma lay curled on the bed, IV band gently taped to her hand, crayons scattered beside her untouched lunch tray. The doctor said she had experienced emotional shock. Her cheek had healed, but her silence hadn't. She hadn't spoken since the wedding. Not to Sarah, not to the nurses, not even when given ice cream. Matthew stepped in carefully, not wanting to disturb the space. Sarah looked up from the chair beside the bed. "She asked for you," she said, voice soft. "Didn't say your name. Just pointed to the pin on my coat. I wore the rainbow one today." He nodded, stepping closer. He didn't know what to expect. He had worked with children for years, some withdrawn, some explosive, but it never stopped being personal when pain was written in such small, quiet bodies. He sat at the edge of the bed, not too close. "Hey, Emma," he said gently. "I brought something." From his coat, he pulled out a sketch pad and a tiny box of pencils. He flipped to a blank page and began to draw, slow, careful lines that formed a bird with open wings. Emma watched. Her eyes followed every stroke. He didn't speak again, just drew. A tree, a swing, a small figure at the base, smiling up at the bird, then a whisper. "Can you make her hair curly like mine?" Matthew paused, then smiled without looking up. Of course, it was the first thing she had said in 6 days. Sarah covered her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. That moment was quiet, unshared. No cameras, no applause, but it was real, and it was healing. 3 weeks later, Matthew stood before a judge, not for anything dramatic, just paperwork, a signature, a conversation. He had volunteered to become Emma's alternate legal guardian, a protective measure. Should anything ever happen to Sarah, he didn't expect it to be approved so quickly. but the judge had read the report. Matthew's years of teaching, his long-standing work in trauma-informed care, the statements from families he'd helped quietly for years, and most importantly, Sarah's request. "I trust him," she had said. "He showed up when others disappeared." The judge signed the papers. When he left the courthouse, Emma was waiting on the steps with a box of colored chalk. She handed him a piece. "Draw with me," he knelt beside her. "Only if you don't mind sharing." They filled the sidewalk with the skies and yos in a rainbow bus that Emma insisted was only for kind people. That night, Matthew tucked the guardianship form into a drawer, not as a trophy, but as a quiet promise. Not all families are built on blood. Some are built on choice. Some on courage. Some on a moment when someone says no more, and someone else finally listens. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Emma looked up from her drawing and asked, "Uncle Matthew, will you come to art class with me tomorrow?" He smiled, brushing chalk dust from her nose. "If you let me sit next to you," he said, "I'll even bring snacks." She nodded. "Only if it's the rainbow cookies." And in that tiny exchange, something profound settled into place. Not a replacement for what was broken, but a beginning for something that had never been given a fair chance. Have you ever had to step in when no one else would, or wished someone had done the same for you? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to follow Heart Story for more stories that bring truth, love, and redemption into the light.